a former Associate Minister of Foreign Affairs and Alliance MP, who was part of the Clark administration way back, has come out and on media in New Zealand and on Russian media suggested that our view, the narrative that I would suggest most New Zealanders believe about Ukraine might not be all that it seems. To explore this idea, we are joined now by Matt Robson. Matt, long time no talk. Welcome to the platform.
Yes, good morning, Sean. Yes, it has been some time, but I have followed your progress.
What are you doing with yourself now?
I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth, unfortunately.
Join the club.
I work as a barrister.
All right.
Doing mainly employment and immigration law, which were my fields.
All right.
And doing some writing from time to time.
First, I want to know, how did RT or these news outlets get hold of you?
Well, I watched the debate, a staged event on sanctions on Russia, and I'd been following the issues in the Ukraine for quite some time, and in fact the issues of NATO and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. And what I noticed about the Parliament 2 hours is that there was never a mention of the complex history of the Ukraine. Nothing about the Minsk Agreement, nothing about the issues of NATO and the Warsaw Pact dissolving, etc. So I said to myself, how can they make a decision like this, which they'd never made before, for instance, with the Iraq war, without actually
but we sent troops to
research?
Afghanistan. We have made decisions like this. We sent troops to Afghanistan, didn't we?
Yes, we did, and that was called a special operation, I believe. Yeah. So just back to this, the reason I think that RT picked it up, I mean, I had never been on one of their programs, although I think they do some very good work. In the past, I've watched their programs.
Banned by Sky TV in New Zealand at the moment for problematic reporting.
Well, I've seen people on RT, I just came across them, I've never seen before interviewed on other media. But anyway, they picked up my articles where I was critical of this, and I also pointed out in my article, where I believe from my research, this was a civil war, and this has been planned for a long time, and the United States and NATO have a very big role. And the very least I expected of our Parliament was to discuss the complexities rather than rushing us into war. And of course, I discovered a number of other things while I was doing research on this, including our membership, non-member cooperating status with NATO, which even I was surprised at, was never brought up when I was in Cabinet. I believe we started doing it in 2001. And in the debate in Parliament, or I'd call it a staged event, not a mention of our role in NATO, our interoperability, nor, as I say, of the Minsk agreements and all the other complexities. So that's what got me saying, I don't believe that the New Zealand public has heard a debate. It's heard one narrative.
Okay, so you've got a counter-narrative. Now, a civil war, I haven't seen a civil war that involves another nation invading your country. Give me an example of a civil war when tanks and personnel, military personnel from another country have invaded the country. That just doesn't seem, I'm not a lawyer, but that doesn't seem like a civil war to me. Matt.
All right. Well, because we're in the modern era, and you could say that, Syria has a civil war going on. Well, the United States.
Oh, it's a war by proxy, isn't it?
Well, it's been going since 2011. So there's foreign.
Okay,
foreign
but let's come back to the Ukraine.
You could say that the Afghanistan war was war by proxy, if you like, was a civil war when the Mujahideen were romanticized by the United States.
Okay, but let's get back to the Ukraine. I don't see any American boots on the ground in the Ukraine.
No, and there's a very good reason for that, because the Pentagon, unlike the State Department and others, is very aware that if you expand this war, that it could become a much wider war, including use of nuclear weapons. So let's go back to this point. There is also the fact, which hasn't been discussed, that right up until 2022, this year, February, when the Russian army invaded, that there was a war going on. You say it's a civil war, but it was heavily financed, armed, and trained by NATO. And the whole question of NATO was on the agenda from 1991, when the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, and the Russians were raising the question of their security and NATO's expansion right to their border. So New Zealanders need to think what would happen in Mexico if Russia and China were on the US border. I don't think that to ask the question too long.
Do you think Zelensky? Are you suggesting Zelensky isn't what he seems? Isn't a plucky young guy fighting for his life and the sovereignty of his country? Are you suggesting he supports Nazis, for example?
Well, he does. I mean, look, the question of Nazis and the role of the Nazis. There's been a number of studies on that, and that's what whether people come.
But Russia supports, as Robert Patman said, Russia supports the far right in Germany. It supports Trump, Bolsonaro.
Well, Robert Patman should stick to the Ukraine and the Azov Battalion and the far right sector, which were in the government, which took place very much so in the 2014.
Zelensky's Jewish, for goodness sake, man. Zelensky is Jewish, for goodness sake.
Yes, and supporting the far right is not something that anybody who's Jewish is automatically ruled out. And using people of all sorts, and including the far right sector, which has threatened him. Just go back to the question of Zelensky. Since 2014, there has been a war, a civil war going on. 14,000 people killed. Just before the Russians invaded, the artillery bombardment of the Donbass republics, the Russian-speaking areas, which have been guaranteed their autonomy under Minsk, which is what our parliament should be becoming familiar with, there was an increase and more than likely was going to invade. That's when Russia went in. Now, the question of the Azov Battalion and the far right. Time magazine, I suggest to you, Sean, you get hold of it. The Time magazine have written a very extensive report on the influence. These people do not muck around. These people have been financed and trained and armed by our traditional allies. And they have death squads. And come back to Zelensky. He campaigned in 2019 on a peace platform to honor the Minsk agreements. Afterwards, he was threatened with his own life, as many of them were. And in this period, don't forget that he's also been named, if he's the great hero, no, I don't think he's a great hero, he's been named in the Panama Papers with all his money offshore. I haven't seen a patriotic president doesn't pay.
So what do you want? Should we lay down and let Putin and Russia roll through Ukraine?
They're not going to roll through Ukraine. They
Clearly not, because the Ukrainians...
They have made it very clear. Well, let me just say this. They have made it very clear. And there's military experts. If we could get New Zealand to have a look at all of the different research that's going on about the Ukraine and analysis, and not just one narrative, we would see that the Russian army has concentrated on those areas which under the Minsk agreement were agreed to be free of the repression that is carried out. And back to Zelensky, the opposition...
Well, why did they invade Kiev until they got their bums kicked? Why are they trying to take Odessa?
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's why it would be good to have a debate and have on our media, your media, other media, other analysts who are Russians, who are all sorts of people.
But you're getting, okay, you talk to RT. Let's get into you can say what you're saying, that it's got to outrage a lot of people, Matt. No problem with that. But we are a free country. We do have freedom of speech. Russians don't, mate. Russian media don't. Okay? It is a repressive regime where people have no human rights, where people are getting arrested and thrown in prison for holding up a white piece of cardboard.
We're talking about the war in the Ukraine. We could have a discussion on what's happening in Russia and the and that is also a complex situation. But we're talking about
No, it's totalitarianism. That's pretty straightforward, and it's oligarchy, right?
But hang on, oligarchs and influence. You could have that influence across the whole world. You could have it about the 1% who are influential in the United States. That's a big debate. You could have it in the UK. You could have it in the whole of Europe of the people. You could have Berlusconi in Italy. So there's a number of issues. If you go back to the Ukraine, what hasn't been discussed is what has been the role of NATO. What was the role of the United States with a massive financing, arming, well before this? And to the far-right sector, which has enormous influence, had ministers of the government, has death squads. What's been carrying on in the Ukraine well before the Russian intervention has been the fact that the far-right, and there's been not just the Azov Battalion, there's a number of them, have just kicked indoors, murdered journalists, murdered people who've been said to be pro-Russian. And if you're talking about the suppression of rights, yes, they're in the Ukraine. What my argument had been, and I hope that there is a a bigger and wider debate in New Zealand is that whatever government you had in Russia, you went back to the Bolsheviks, you went to Stalin's, his totally repressive government, if you go through to the United Party of Putin and others, they look out the window, they saw Yugoslavia dismembered. They saw that NATO has never been a defensive alliance. It was set in 1949 to keep the colonies of Britain and France and the Netherlands and support the American interventions around the world in civil wars and others, all throughout Latin America, Central America, Asia. We know it from Vietnam. And by the way, when I campaigned on the war in Vietnam, I was used to being called a puppet, and not just me, but many others. I was a young person at the time, a puppet of Moscow, a puppet of China, etc. So the debate was closed down until people started looking at the complexities and other stories. And if we go to the Ukraine, the only person who seems in the world, most ironically, in the United States, calling for peace is Trump. The United States political establishment,
and as we know, a great friend of Russia.
Well, that was part of the that's another debate. The question of how much was that a beat up in the United States? By the way, you probably know from my politics, Trump is not my cup of tea.
Yeah, and not at all.
Don Chomsky has pointed out that he also does not have Trump as his cup of tea, but he said, "Don't shoot the messenger. There's a need for peace." And for New Zealand,
Matt, would you rather live in Russia or a NATO country?
Well, that's back to the Cold War type of thing. That if you oppose, for instance,
calling people Nazis, and typifying an invasion as a civil war is back to the Cold War rubbish, man.
I don't want to live in either country. It's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about whether this war is what it seems. And what I'm saying is that, yes, I say that Russia had justifiable security questions. I say that NATO is not a defensive alliance. I say that New Zealand is actually got it. Our politicians should be reading what happened in the First World War when you had alliances on both sides and which led into a war. And by the way, of course, the Ukraine, it's been stated by American representatives, is also part of their pivot to Asia, the Indo-Pacific. And one of the real targets, have said themselves, is China, the containment of China. So New Zealand, under a Labour government, seems to have thrown overboard our position that I campaigned for as the minister, not just associate foreign minister, but disarmament and arms control, not to be part of a nuclear armed bloc, and to take a position where we could come to the table as if there are negotiations and push for it with clean hands. We can't do that now. We're sending howitzers to train people to have howitzers. We've got intelligence. We're targeting Russian and Ukrainian who are in the civil war who are against the Kiev regime.
Gosh, okay. So you say we should pull back. We shouldn't send those people to Britain. We shouldn't have sanctions.
I don't think we should.
Okay, should we have sanctions?
We shouldn't. Because we didn't have them on Iraq, for example. We didn't have them on America when the overthrow of Allende. We need a debate in the Parliament where these facts are discussed. If they come to another decision, that's something. But don't just have Robert Patman and all the New Zealand academics who, for my money, I've never seen them have.
So you want us to essentially not align ourselves, and listen to what I say carefully, not align ourselves against a man and a government that suppresses free speech of its own citizens, murders journalists, poisons political opponents, and has a sham of elections for President and Prime Minister. You're on Putin's side here, man.
No, that's an old tactic. You could say the same about...
It's not an old tactic. Those are facts, man, about life in modern Russia.
No. I've just said that Zelensky's regime has done the same. They have death squads. They have repression. They have closed down television statements. They have closed down the opposition. They have used false accusations.
Well, they're under martial law because they're being invaded by Russia.
This goes back to 2014. This goes back to 2014 when Russia was upholding the Minsk agreements, didn't agree for Donetsk and Luhansk. We have got a media. This is not attacking you. I'm saying coming through the media mostly is Putin is just the most evil person. There's no need to listen to him. There are no concerns that the Russians have got. For goodness sake, if we took that argument, New Zealand would invade Saudi Arabia.
Well, why is Russia's
invading
ambassador
Yemen.
to
One of the worst
Geneva?
regimes in the world.
Why has Russia's ambassador to Geneva resigned in the past 24 hours and said he's never been more ashamed of the actions of his country?
Well, I haven't interviewed him. I don't know what his reasons are. I suppose in Russia, just as we're having a discussion, there are discussions. There are
discussions in Russia in the open because you get sent to the gulag if you say the wrong thing.
No, that's where you're absolutely wrong. There are a number of intellectuals and journals throughout Russia which take a different viewpoint. But yes, there is a war going on, and I'm not arguing there's not repression. I'm arguing about what's actually happening in the Ukraine. And I'm saying that we look at our side of the fence, it is full of not very nice. NATO is not a nice organization.
I don't know. NATO, Russia, NATO. I'm going NATO. I'm sorry, Rob. They represent values that I feel more comfortable with, and I think the vast majority of New Zealanders feel more comfortable with.
Can I just say, that's the mantra, unthinking mantra I've heard from Jacinda and Nania, the shared values of our traditional allies. Our traditional allies, if you take just the United States, took us into Vietnam. 5 million people lie dead under their military regime across Indochina.
And tens of thousands of them died on islands all across the Pacific to stop us being invaded and occupied by the Japanese Empire.
No, you're leaving out the Chinese. The Chinese lost over 5 million people. They held up the Japanese army.
Boy, Rob, you always move on from when I make a point. But what about? That's classic, but what aboutism?
Is it classic? No. You're saying these are the people we share values with. That was your question.
They spilt their blood for us.
Do we share the values? Were they there for us? Why are about 5/8 of the world not joining in the sanctions? Why is it said that the world is just Europe and North America? Have a look at the other countries. Many of them have been invaded directly by the United States or its allies, or indirectly. And it's not just about whataboutism. Your question was, we share those values. Do we share the values of Australia, which rushed off to Iraq? Do we share the values of Australia, which supported the invasion of East Timor, as we did? Those are the values you're talking about. We have historical amnesia. We're not part of a democratic, all-giving world. We're part of a world a very rich world, which has enjoyed the monopoly of the resources of the world and wants to keep it that way. So we're not joined by the rest of the world in this self-congratulatory mood. And I would ask our government to stop using the mindless mantra, shared democratic values, because it's anything but that when you look at the record. Because, by the way, have a think about what happened with the Solomons. Did the Solomons not have a right to sign an agreement with China, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing? They didn't get stuck into Australia when Australia signed the AUKUS agreement, or when New Zealand has signed agreements for joining NATO.
I think we dropped the ball up in the Solomons, I must say, quite severely.
Well, I don't think we dropped the ball. We haven't got a right to tell them what they want. If they want to sign an agreement with China, they're a sovereign country. And when Jacinda called them our backyard, my goodness, that goes back to everything that horrifies people about our patronising attitude to the Pacific. Here, Mummy doesn't like what you did. Snap on the hand.
I don't think we're powerful enough, to be honest, to be patronising to anyone in reality, Rob, are we?
Those appear to be. You asked about values. Yeah. I'm saying those are the values. Does that exculpate, the crimes of Stalin or Mao Zedong? No, I don't think it does. And nor are suggesting that we join an alliance with them.
All right.
Just go back to the Ukraine. It is not what it seems. And would you agree with me, Sean, that
I get the feeling that if we were having this conversation in 1940, you'd be telling me that Hitler was horribly misunderstood.
Well, would I? Would I? Why would I do that?
Well, given your view on Putin and Russia, I think you would actually, yeah.
You would start looking at the war in 1940, going back to the Spanish Civil War. That's where they had their testing ground. I wasn't alive, neither were you, but my sympathies and support are for the Spanish Republic against the fascists. My sympathies were against what Hitler did, etc. Yeah. But to
Putin,
say that
he's okay, the great liberator of the Ukrainian people.
Well, yes, of course, and that's what many of the fascist groups in Ukraine uphold, the pictures of Stalin, the SS, and so forth. So there's a lot to look at in the Ukraine. But
I think you're damn lucky, Matt, that you live in a country where we can have look, quite a long conversation in terms of public media about this, and no one's going to knock on your door, or not yet, and drag you away for wrongthink. But I'm just saying the country that you appear to be defending or allying with yourself does not afford people that liberty.
No, but that's a straw argument, because that is not the situation in Ukraine. It's not a question of democracy.
No, I'm talking about Russia, mate. It's not the situation in Russia.
But it's not a question of democracy against autocracy. If
Why not?
The United States,
for a lot of people it is.
Well, that means that perhaps they need to start thinking about the complexities of what's happening in the Ukraine, and the questions. The questions of the security of Russia are not just by Matt Robson. American ambassadors, including Kennan, who wrote the famous doctrine in 1948 that America had 6% of the world's population, something like 60% of resources, had no friends, had interests, and keep it that. That's guided them. But Kennan is a very, very old man now, came out and said this is nonsense to put NATO right up against the border of Russia. And you've only got... Why want our parliament? Read Berezynski, the Grand Chessboard. Weaken Russia, split it up into three. Have a look what happened in Yugoslavia. Kosovo's gone. The Germans piled in and took over Croatia. Slovenia, Austria, they split up Yugoslavia. They bombed for 78 days under the US and NATO. Without
Matt,
UN
we could probably argue all morning. I thank you for coming on, as I said, in our open and tolerant democracy, sharing views that I'm sure many people will find interesting, but it may have given them pause for thought. And I think it is always...
In an open democracy, we have more opinions and voices, which is good. And that's what we should have on the Ukraine.
Yeah.
And we should have it in the parliament.
And we should have it in Russia too. But I tell you what, they don't right now. Thank you very much for joining us. That is Matt Robson, former Associate Minister of Foreign Affairs. Well, he wasn't backing down. We've got it all wrong. Putin's the good guy. Those lousy Ukrainians, it's a civil war. Man, interesting. What did you think of that? I enjoyed that discussion, to be honest.